My goal here is to provide some sort of best practices for communicating with coaches and really anyone who's not as data friendly or as familiar with the data. So I'm probably going to say coaches a lot, but you can substitute in scouts or players or anyone you're dealing with who may not have the level of knowledge that we have when we're talking about dealing with data. I'm going to focus on data visualization. A lot of these principles can be applied general to communication, but we're going to kind of focus on data viz a little bit. First, some background on me, just so you know where I'm coming from. I don't have I'll call it a programming or a hardcore statistical background in the mathematical sense. I work right now for TruMedia Networks, which partners with Opta to develop ProVision, which is on that monitor over there. It's Opta's data, it's TruMedia's engineering. It comes out looking pretty, and teams and media can use it. So we work on a lot of sports, but obviously we're talking mostly about soccer here. Before that, I was at ESPN for 10 years. I worked on a lot of different sports, all sports, SportsCenter, etc. But I specialized in soccer, covered a couple World Cups on site, several Women's World Cups, Euros, all the usual club and US games that went along with that. And my role there was largely communicating directly to talent. So you're watching the World Cup in Brazil and you see Bob Lee and Alexi and Gilberto Silva or whatever sitting at the desk in front of the pretty beach, and I'm 5 feet off camera yelling at them during breaks to try to get them to say something fun or whatever, or they're yelling at me asking me a question. So that was more or less my role, was communicating with talent, communicating with producers to try and get this information into easy to digest things, whether it's a fun stat, whether it's something a little more advanced, whatever it might be. And before that, I worked in TV, radio, newspaper, doing play-by-play, doing sports talk radio, writing up games, things like that. So all of this, a common theme that runs through all these jobs and kind of what Oliver referenced. I think there's similarities in what a lot of you guys do is you got to have the ability to explain things quickly and succinctly. This goes for verbally, this goes for visuals as well. Because if you can't get it across to someone quickly, then you're going to lose them. And to get to that point, there's a lot of filtering out information. If you look at whatever F24 feet or whatever it is, there's a stat sheet. You got to be able to pick out what matters from this game. Like there's a skill and ability to do that a lot of people like us have developed through the years. So for me, it was working with television, radio, whatever it was. For you guys, it's being able to get that information directly to coaches. You've got the large quantities of data. You got to be able to do something with it. And you got to be able to make it all digestible for the non-quantitative types who might be seeing this information for the first time, whether it's a coach, whether in my case producer, whether it's a viewer, whatever it might be. So there's a lot of similarities in these roles, and ultimately we're kind of translators in a sense. We're taking these numbers and the data and making everything digestible for people with not much experience. And one thing I'll say before we really get going, a lot of these things are not definitive. Things can be very different from person to person you're dealing with, from situation to situation. So don't treat this as gospel. Like I said, this is kind of a best practices thing that I've come across. Things can change a lot depending on your audience. I'm going to say things to you guys differently than I would say to a room of coaches or something like that. So it depends on your audience, depends on your goal in presenting the data, but these are general tips I've kind of learned over the years for having success breaking through with people with data viz. So I got 3 main points today. Keep it simple, which I think is pretty straightforward. Speak the language. We've heard some people, I think Tyler mentioned this already, be able to talk to coaches in their language, which means a few different things, and tell a story. Because if you can concisely get across your points, even without using the numbers, then you can get people kind of hooked before you've even really told them anything. So these are the 3 things we're going to run through here. So keeping it simple. From a TV perspective, we did a lot of graphics like this. Your basic table, show the key numbers from a game. So this is a fine graphic. This is MLS Cup 2016, which Seattle won on penalties, and despite doing basically nothing offensively. So this is a fine graphic, but this is kind of an example of where you can keep it simpler. Because if you're trying to tell a story of this game, your bottom 2 rows, your possession, your touches, A, kind of say the same thing, and B, aren't really the point of the graphic in a lot of ways. So you can trim those off. If you want to use possession, you don't need that extra decimal point. These are really little things, but when you can clean things up as much as possible and simplify them for people, it just saves in that 1/10 of a second or that second or two in trying to figure out what you're getting at. So you could cut this graphic easily down to 3 rows and still get that point across that, look, Seattle didn't do anything offensively and they still won. So to that end, at ESPN, we developed what we called a big number template, which basically did just that. Here's the whole point of, from a macro level, this is when Virginia Tech beat Virginia 13th straight time in football. This is the whole point. If you're from Virginia or went there, I'm sorry. But this is the whole point. This is the note. You could build a graphic with a few numbers smaller than 13 and some random years when those things happened, but this is the whole point. And so what I'm kind of getting at here is that analysts are kind of a human big number template. You're taking the bigger amount of data, you're changing it down to the one simple thing that you really need to get across in a lot of ways. And that's why your expertise is essential. Because there's value in handing the coach the same sheet of data before a game or after a game every time. And there's also value in filtering it down for him and highlighting the one thing or cutting it down to the one thing and really keeping it simple. So in the same way we can cut text down, we can also cut graphics down and make them a little easier to understand. So this is the Red Bulls tackles last year. I think it was 700 some odd tackles they made during the regular season. And it's not too difficult to grasp. You know, you can see they're pressing more on the outside, not a ton in kind of the center of the field from a horizontal standpoint. So this isn't bad, but we can make this a little bit simpler if we change it to something like this. So we're basically binning it into zones here, and it just makes it that much clearer and that much faster for a coach to grasp, to see that the outside thirds of the field is really where they're pressing, especially in the middle. There's nothing on the offensive end from a New York standpoint. And this, A, makes it easier to grasp, and B, which I think is important from a coaching standpoint, is it makes it actionable. You've got something, you know, they know to either avoid these areas or at least be aware of what is coming if you're dribbling or passing into these areas. So by keeping it simple, make it actionable, it's just a little bit easier. You know, if a coach can digest this in 2 or 3 seconds instead of 5 or 10 seconds, it sounds like not much, but it's a pretty big win. And it's a reminder, just more info doesn't always equal best info. So I mean, you're showing the same thing with this. It's just a little bit less, a little bit easier for coaches to digest. And again, with the more info doesn't equal best info thing, I think this was a Tom blog post. And this is a good graphic for a blog post. Because if it's digital, you have the time to look at it. You have the time to absorb it. So this is it's a 3x3 clarity and pressure graph for Manchester City's shots last year. So not too surprisingly, you know, your top right corner, they took a lot of shots that were clear and didn't have pressure. This is not something you want to hand to someone who's not super familiar with the data because their eyes are going to glaze over really fast. This is great when you have 10, 30 seconds to look over it. It's not something that you want to pass on to someone who's unfamiliar with it. Excuse me. So if you're going to use this information, you probably want to boil it down to a sentence or something and hand it on to them. So I'm not saying this is a bad graphic. I'm saying it's, right, Tom? You got it? Not a bad graphic. I'm just saying for purposes of someone who's not as inclined to the information, you've got to keep it simple. Here's another example. So you've probably seen shot charts that are similar to this, where you've got 2 or 3 different variables to do a shape, size, location. In this case, you know, was it foot or header? So you've got, 40 different possibilities between the 3 variables here. So there's a whole lot going on. So again, this isn't something you want to hand to someone who's not familiar with it. You want to keep it simple. You figure out what your point of the graphic is and just turn it into a basic shot chart. So, you know, we could do the same thing with this. This is a messy shot chart from earlier in the season. Your simple point here is that he's taking a lot of shots from outside the box. You don't need triangles and different shades or whatever it might be to get that point across. Just keep it simple. There's really nothing fancy here. Just use it to get to the point of what you're trying to say quickly. As part of keeping it simple, I think it's important to make things intuitive. You know, it's kind of obvious to say this, but sometimes it's worth repeating. So this is a passing chart, and I really don't have to tell you what's going on here. The green is good, the red is bad, and this was a pretty good game. I believe this was Miguel Almiron game earlier this year. So color is an easy way to keep things intuitive. This is assuming you're not dealing with people who have colorblind issues. And if that's the case, obviously you're going to reassess and find a different way to tell that story. Sizing is another way to do it. So this is scaled by expected goals. I probably could have taken the legend off in the corner and still you get the same point. Larger is better. So this is the same shot chart that I showed on the last slide for Messi. It's just scaled by expected goals. So the size, bigger is better is a pretty intuitive thing. And then this one, there's a lot going on here. It kind of combines the two in that green is good, dark green is better. The bigger squares are sizing the quantity and the color is sizing the quality. So there's more going on here, but you've got a couple things that are fairly intuitive. This is an Almiron zone chart from, I believe, all of last season. So you can see where he's making his passes from and the kind of success he's having from those locations. So making things intuitive makes it easier for anyone to pick up. If you don't know if a graphic's working, one thing, at ESPN a lot of times, we build tons of graphics for shows. And sometimes you spend half an hour trying to build this one graphic and trying to get it right. And by the time you're done, you're not even sure what you're trying to say. You just got to show it to somebody else. Like, does this make any kind of sense? And then you get that fresh set of eyes, which is how a producer or talent or a viewer is going to look at it. And they can just tell you, you got too much going on here. I don't understand this. Or they might say it's great. So a lot of times you get a fresh set of eyes. So if you have someone you can run it by, whether it's in your organization or a trusted confidant outside, just to look at something and make sure you're not crazy, that helps a lot too. So keep it simple. Simplify your graphics as much as possible when you're passing them on to people. Make them as intuitive as possible. And all of this is kind of building toward the same thing, which is to focus on the most important ways and important things in easy to understand ways. That's the keep it simple portion. Speak the language. I bet you did not think the 5 love languages was going to be referenced here today. I don't know, you may or may not be familiar with this book, but it's printed in like 50 languages and 12 million copies or something like that. And the gist of it is that people need to be loved in certain ways. This is talking about romantic relationships and saying that some people need words of encouragement, others need acts of service. And this is how people communicate and receive love. And those are the keys to a strong romantic relationship, to understanding how to use those languages to best communicate with your spouse or significant other. So think of the analyst-coach relationship sort of like this, minus the romantic part, presumably. By learning how to speak their language, you are strengthening your relationship, you're building trust. Maybe there's a literal aspect to this, as soccer is obviously a multicultural sport and world. So, if you can learn your keywords or whatever it is in a different language, that's obviously helpful. But really more I'm talking about learning the terminology, and I mean that in a couple different ways. If you're American and your coach is British, I think it's silly to get tied up in pitch or field or whatever. But if the coach hates it and it's going to be a turnoff and it's an obstacle, we have to swallow our pride and kind of adapt to whatever it might be. Again, not a big deal, I don't think. Some people are pretty anal about things like this. But more importantly, even then, the terminology from kind of a soccer standpoint, I think, is, or I should say, more important than the terminology from a British-American standpoint is the soccer lingo. Because if you can learn their terminology in the sense, maybe they very distinctly call a forward something, or this is a forward does this and a striker does this. Some coaches will slice that pretty thin. Some will use zone 14 instead of saying the top of the box. If you can use that terminology and understand what they're saying, and that starts with listening, and then you can incorporate that terminology into your own work. So you can say, hey, this happens at the top of the box, but if you can say this happens in zone 14, that's just a shortcut, and it shows that you're interested and that you're listening to them and that you're on the same page more. I saw this a lot at ESPN, more on the NFL side, where if you could drop the right term into a conversation or a graphic, whatever it might be, the Mike linebacker instead of the middle linebacker, or whatever it was, something like that, and the analyst kind of didn't look at you as much of a nerd anymore, and it just helped build that trust a little bit. So every coach has their own lingo, whether it's for a position, whether it's for how they attack, whatever it might be. Learning those things is a good shortcut and proxy in a way to build trust and build that relationship. And then kind of from a stats standpoint, I had a lot of success just framing stats differently. Expected goals is kind of a scary word, I think, to we'll say your non-quantitative types. So I'd talk to analysts that we would have, and they would hate expected goals, and at the same time, they're talking about this team needs to take better shots. And you're kind of like, what? Yeah, this is what I've been saying. So if I could frame it in terms of shot quality, then you have more success getting through. So if you can listen to your coaches, listen to your staff, whatever it might be, know what they're talking about and how they talk about it, and speak that same way and try to frame the stats a little bit differently, then you can have more success. So the visuals can kind of help with this. This is kind of a couple different ways of going about the same thing. This is a solid graphic from a TV standpoint, or just your basic things. This was a Premier League game, I want to say November. Your shots are the same, your shots on goal are basically the same. XG is very different, which obviously means the away team here took a lot better shots. Some coaches you can probably hand this to, and they'll do well with it. Some would rather see something like this. So this is the same thing, it's just the two shot charts, and you can see pretty quickly visually Manchester United took many better shots than Bournemouth did in this game. And they came back to win 2-1, I think it was Rashford in stoppage time or something like that. So both these approaches are fine. This is about knowing your coach and speaking their language, whether are they going to prefer it in a table, or are they going to rather see something graphically that says the same thing. Because I think most of these coaches, you'd probably agree over the years, non-analytical types in general, they learn to trust their eyes. There's pros and cons to that, and we have to figure out how to use that to our advantage by giving them the info in the way they like. Sometimes this is really simple. One potential ProVision client didn't like this basic table that was in a post-match report. They wanted something that looks like this, which, I mean, if you're like me, you kind of roll your eyes and you think it's comically simple, because it kind of is. But this kind of goes back to the things about the British/American lingo. At some point, you just kind of suck it up and say, okay, fine, we'll do this, and we'll build the trust that way and build that relationship. And it's worth, it's so simple, it's so easy that doing it is totally worth the trust you can build. Excuse me, sorry. Another alternative to try and get around tables and such is just to put something on a field or a court. So I want to share some examples from a few different sports. So I was in spring training last year, and we were showing our baseball product, TruMedia's baseball product, to a whole coaching staff. And so we started with this table of Freddie Freeman stats in different situations, and you could almost hear the coach's eyes kind of glaze over, nobody's responding to anything. We show them the heat map, and suddenly they're chattering, like, oh, I told you we couldn't get him out with inside pitches, he couldn't hit the away pitch, why didn't we throw him more high fastballs, and something like that. It's the same data, it's just giving them a good visual and putting it in context that they know, which is basically a strike zone. Gives them something that they can talk about and understand a lot more easily. Basketball example. This was from a sports center I worked on a couple years ago. So Golden State lost this game 3 of, I think, the conference semis in Utah. Curry and Thompson did not shoot well. So I started with this basic graphic. It's fine. It gives you the numbers. You got to do a little mental math to figure it out. But I ended up landing on a much better version, which was this shot chart. You're combining the stats into one column, which is helpful. It saves the math. But more importantly is you're plotting these shots in a very easy to understand way. So you don't even have to look at the numbers. They could be left off entirely, really. And they didn't shoot very well. And you get the added benefit of showing the shot location, which played right into the analyst, I want to say it was Tim Legler, who then went on, Utah was defending Curry well. They're keeping him out of the paint. Rudy Gobert, something in the middle. So by doing this visually, you get more information and you set up the analyst to kind of run with it because it's what they know. Another example, just real simple, U.S. wasn't very good against Italy. This is the men's team in November. So I could give you a dozen stats why, or just show you this from the first half, which is their touches. And there's a big gap that's missing. So sometimes the visual is just really easy, and you can do it that way. So just to kind of tie it all together about speaking the language to earn trust, don't come in throwing bombs. It's kind of, we're not throwing R squared and p-values and whatever in off the bat because nobody wants to hear that if you're an analyst. So just as an example, in 2009 was the first time I really worked with Alexi Lawless. This was for the Confederations Cup that the U.S. men were in. So we didn't come in telling them, look, we have all this data, you need to use it, blah, 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 in part because we didn't have a ton because we weren't working with Opta yet, but we didn't start by telling them all the things that we could track, and here's what info had to make error. We just asked him what sort of things that we could track for him. And you can probably guess what he said, which was set pieces, right? So we did some very rudimentary tracking, both numerically and visually. It may have involved Microsoft Paint. I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't find any of these visuals, which I was very disappointed about. But we talked about what he liked. And we showed him some information, and not a ton of it made air, but that was almost not the point. But we're talking about what he liked, and we built that trust with them. And we also began to kind of support what he knew. So I'm in studio with him, and I would listen to what he's saying. And as we got access to Opta data for the World Cup the next year, it's just listening to him talk with Bob Lee about games. And Alexi says something like, boy, Rooney has really disappeared. So I'm thinking, okay, how do I quantify it? Okay, how many touches did he have in the last 20 minutes of this game, at least in an important place, and give him a number. And it's easy for him to understand because he already knows what he's trying to say, and it's something to back it up. So by starting with something that they know and supporting that, it's a way to really build the trust. You show them the basics like that, and then you kind of slowly pull them over to the dark side, as I like to say. Because you're speaking their language to start with, then they know to trust you, and then you can kind of show them, okay, here's other things we can do. They don't have to know how to use Provision or something like that, but as long as they know it's available, they know what they can ask about, and within not too long, Alexi would ask for touches or passes or something along those lines. Relatively simple stats, but things that were more advanced than where we were when we started. So speaking the language is an important thing on the whole process. Tell me a story. So this is what we always try to do on television. Tell the story of a game, a player, a season through stats. A stat wouldn't work on TV if I couldn't explain it to, say, Bob Lee in 5 or 10 seconds. In the same way, if you can't tell the story of a visualization in a quick sentence, then it might be too complicated for that purpose. And another thing I always had to keep in mind is not only do I have to be able to explain it to Bob or whoever it is quickly, they have to be able to explain it to a viewer just as quickly. So they have to understand it well enough to be able to relay it. So when you're telling a coach something, the coach not only has to understand what you're saying to them, they have to be able to relay it to a player or another coach. So you have to take that extra step of clarity to get it to them quickly. So here's a good example of how this worked. So the first heat map I got on TV was following this Milan-Barcelona game in 2013. Goals, Boateng had a goal, Montari had a goal. Milan won this one 2-0, and everyone thought Barcelona was in crisis. They ended up winning the second leg easily and advanced, but that's not the point right now. So SportsCenter producer asked, what happened in this game? Why did Barcelona lose? This team that shouldn't lose lost. What happened? So I started with something like this, and these numbers are actually fairly compelling. You can see Barcelona had twice as many touches, almost 4 times as many in the attacking third, but actually fewer in the attacking penalty area. For SportsCenter purposes, when you're dealing with producers and talent who generally aren't soccer knowledgeable, just the fact that you have these stats and numbers they're not familiar with is going to cause hesitation. And if the producer and talent are hesitant, then chances are it's not going to make air. So instead of going to something like this, we went with a visual. And this is pretty obvious even to a non-soccer person. Getting the ball close to a goal is good, and you can see that Barcelona got the ball almost close to goal a lot, but not actually close to goal at all. And this is pretty easy to understand, and it's a pretty easy story to tell. Barcelona didn't get the ball in the box. It's just that easy. You almost don't need any of the additional context of how many touches they had in the box or whatever it might be. By telling that story, if they can't get the ball in the box, you have the visual go with it, and it works really well together. I mentioned when talking with coaches, they often want something actionable to go with it. So here's another way, kind of taking that extra step in telling a story. So this is the Union's attacking locations from a game last season. You can see obviously it's right-sided here, which is something. The coach probably can see this from watching the game, but it's something. And to try to make it actionable, you might do something like a passing network, where not only do you see where the locations are, you're seeing who's involved. So then you look at the coach and say, okay, well, you want to cut Ilsinho, I think is 25 here, cut him off from everybody else, and you might kill off the attack. Or if you want to go a step further back, Medunjanin trying to get it to Doshko and Bedoya. to cut it off right there. So you have something actionable that they can take. So you're not just looking at the pass locations, which is, again, something, but you have a little more detail that you can give to a player and show them, stop this and we'll stop the attack. So you're telling a story in that regard, and you're trying to do it better graphically. So be succinct, make the stories actionable, and with the right visual in the story, the numbers are almost irrelevant. You can have the best stat in the world, but if you don't have a simple story to go with it, then breaking through to all these non-analytics people is tough. So one example kind of to pull it all together, just kind of another use case. So this graphic is about where MLS teams began possessions last season. This was an article I wrote for Sports Illustrated and struggled with getting this graphic just right. Wanted to keep it simple. So, it's whole numbers down the side. You don't need to label every single number. Had the whole team name at the bottom, and that was getting too crowded, so it cut it down to tricodes. It's a little deceptive in the scaling, I will say. But this is an academic journal we're talking about. This is a soccer article, so it's okay that Sporting KC didn't start twice as far up the field as Portland, although the graphic kind of makes it look that way. But it's okay for these purposes. Obviously, if you're going in a big journal, not a big deal. But you can fudge things a little bit. It kind of goes to the simplify thing from earlier on. And then the color coding kind of pulled this all together. First I had them all gray, and that just looked a little blah. And then I color coded all the bars, and it looked like a kaleidoscope. And finally, pinpointed the 4 teams that I was really talking about in the articles, the conference finalists. So you can see pretty clearly Sporting KC in New York picked the ball up higher up the field. Atlanta's pretty average, and Portland during the season started at the back, deeper than most teams for the most part. So tried to keep it as simple as possible. As far as speaking the language, I call this average possession start, and I use yards from own goal. And this is where you just got to know your audience. Maybe your coach calls it something else. Maybe the coach wants to see it from the opposite end. How many yards from the opponent's goal? Maybe they prefer meters instead of yards. So there's a lot of speaking the language to be aware of if you're trying to present something like this. I also tried to put this onto a soccer field to see if it worked. And since there's only about a 7-yard difference, trying to plot 23 logos in that space didn't work very well, but it's something to consider if it's there for you. And again, just call it whatever, if it's depth of possession start or whatever it might be. Just know what the coach likes, try to speak their language whatever way you can. And then as far as telling a story, this again was from an article about the 4 conference finalists, and the simple story of this section was how they played differently and pressed or didn't press differently. Again, we talked about the different spots where their possession started. The numbers hardly matter. I could almost leave them off to tell the story. But it's a pretty simple story to understand, and if you know how these teams play, it made sense with what you saw on the field. So these are kind of my suggestions as you look to establish trust and build these relationships with coaches and other non-analytical types. Keep it simple. Speak their language, as visually as you can. Fields are always good, but just simple visualizations and speak the language that they know, especially when you're labeling things and such. And tell me a story. Barcelona had a wall around the box and they couldn't get in. It's really that easy in that regard, and it was something that was very relatable even to a non-soccer audience. So those are the 3 data viz lessons I've learned from the last decade. Working with hardcore soccer people, non-soccer people, everybody in between. People aren't as plugged into numbers and analytics as we often are, and I hope those are useful in your roles as well.